And I want to ask you, maybe broadly speaking, about the wisdom of introspection. The word you just used. Throughout the book, there's many reflection questions and practices. So it's a very practical book that is to be, integrated in daily life as I read it. So could you speak a little more about maybe how you think about the wisdom of introspection?
Well, one thing I'll say is I'm a teacher by training. And so when
Nice.
when I started writing this book, I was like, it's never going to be a thick, massive book of theory. It's the whole thing is practices and light narration and framing, right? So that's where a lot of that comes from. Is I'm a teacher. I've taught high school for 7 years. So that's where I come from. The way I think about wisdom, especially in the practical sense, is really a response to what I've seen. And so I'll frame it this way. I think a lot of times we are taught that wisdom is when you grow older and you're simply able to share what you've learned in life, share, the good things and the bad things and how you can overcome obstacles. I think that is all important, and I think that has a space in wisdom. But there is another part of wisdom, and I'll go back to my story with the man when I was 18. His name was Dale. Um, what I experienced in that moment was the blowing of his trauma through my body, right? Whatever trauma he dealt with in his life that told him he couldn't be himself, he couldn't cry, he couldn't even be around another man who was crying without feeling like he had to step in and say something. He was blowing his own fears and insecurities through my body. And because my central nervous system then had to deal with it, right? And so it's not just cognitive. When I think about what wisdom is, I think about what are the ways that we can age and get older, not necessarily just with age, but with life experience, and become a force of healing rather than blowing our trauma through other people's bodies. So a wise person, an elder, isn't someone who has a nice quip that they can share, right? A little platitude when someone's like in the midst of suffering. A wise elder is someone who is not blowing their own stuff through someone else's body and is instead able to sit person to person and help that person heal the stuff that's within their body. I think that's what a person who has wisdom does for each other, does for another person.
No, I appreciate that, Andrew. And maybe we could jump to the final chapter to begin. You call this particular constriction, I do not know who I am. How do you, and maybe this is a big question, but how do you think about self-transformation in general, as you were just talking about there, knowing ourselves or maybe letting go? There's just so many things that fit underneath an umbrella there, I guess.
Yeah. This is the power of introspection. And this is the power of being intentional. There's a great, so I was at the Living School for Action and Contemplation down in Albuquerque for a couple of years. And one of the teachers there, James Finley, um, he was a monk for 6 years under Thomas Merton. And then when he left the monastery, he became a psychologist. But he did psychotherapy with folks. And I guess that would make him a psychotherapist. There you go. Uh, and and one of the things he shares this beautiful analogy that has really stuck with me. He says, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves skimming over the depths of our own life. And that just hits me every time, skimming over the depths of our own life. Because I think what not knowing who you are is you're stuck on that autopilot. You're stuck with the narratives of what other people have given you. You're stuck with your protective mechanisms that worked at some point, but are now just running without you noticing. And you're just going from thing to thing. And so the power of introspective practices, the power of intentionality, of choosing to no longer skim and choosing to dive into the waters, the power of that is that you begin to notice the you that is underneath those different layers. And I think that's where the phrase unmasking originally came from for me, is that I
Mm.
imagined so many of us walking around with a ton of different masks on, and we change our masks for the different, spaces that we're in. But what are the practices and the spaces that we can move in? What are the ways that we can move, the postures we can embody that will allow us to take off our masks just a little bit? Like, not even big acts of like, now I'm maskless and I'm going to face the world totally vulnerable, because that's going to be real hard, and probably damaging. But how are the ways that we can unmask for 2 seconds more today than yesterday? And I love that you started with the last chapter, because I think that's the entire book leads to that last chapter. It names all these different constrictions, and then it gets to the end point, which is, and I don't know who I am. And I think that's the constriction of all constrictions. And I think in large part, that might even be an underlying constriction underneath all the other ones.